Hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Rachel Repberg with ITS America, and I would like to welcome you to this webinar brought to you by ITS America and Deloitte. Before I hand things over to our first speaker, I just wanted to go over some quick logistical items. As you may have noticed, all participant lines are muted today, and that is to avoid any background noise for our presenters. However, we do encourage you to provide any questions or comments you may have in the chat function, which you will find in the lower part of your screen. There will be some time at the end for Q&A if we have some available time for the presenters to address your questions. I also wanted to mention that today's session is being recorded and a copy of the recording will be available for those shortly after. So with that said, I'd like to turn things over to Shailen Bhatt, President and CEO of ITS America, to get us started.
Classic. It's a technology webinar, and I did not get myself unmuted before getting started. So now that we've got our technical snafu out of the way, good afternoon, everyone. Rachel, thank you for that introduction and for kicking us off. Today, we're going to have a really interesting discussion about technology in transportation with some experts from a little firm called Deloitte. Some of you may have heard of it. They've been around a long time, a really respected voice in the field. And today we're going to have a bunch of panelists. So Rahul Gupta, who I've known for a number of years, a smart infrastructure expert. We'll also have Anant, Dinamani, who works on integrated mobility, Piyush Pandey, who we're going to talk to about cybersecurity, Josephine Tucker. We were in Lisbon, Qashqai, actually, a city just outside of Lisbon last year, and some really cool things going around transit mobility up there. We'll talk about that. And then Bryan Nicol, who, in a previous life was the commissioner or director of the Indiana Department of Transportation, and we've worked together for a number of years. And, just as a former DOT director and secretary in Delaware and Colorado, I always used to say that state DOTs existed for two reasons: to save lives and to make people's lives better. And, when I think about technology, I think that is the lens that we should view technology through. Like, is this a technology that can help us save lives? Or is this a technology that can help us make people's lives better? And, the last, days and weeks and months in America, we've been looking at issues like healthcare and COVID-19 and equity around some of the social issues that we're facing and some real challenges. And so what we really want to talk about today is how we can harness technology to improve the lives of people. And so we'll just get started. When we first started talking about this a couple of years ago, it was all about we were very excited about V2V, right? Vehicles talking to other vehicles. And then we said, well, now vehicles can talk to everything. So it became V2X. And now I find myself talking more and more about, the infrastructure itself talking to everything. So almost an I to X future. And so there's a lot that we've been talking about with 5G, broadband, connectivity, integrating all of that. Rahul, maybe you can sort of talk us through how we blend all of this smart infrastructure and connectivity and really make a difference for people.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, all, and thank you, Shailen. I think you touched on something that is absolutely essential for understanding the complexity, and it is a complex subject because we're moving from a siloed manner to a connected and collaborative manner. So when you talk about V2X to I2X, everything connecting to everything, I think the easiest way to actually demonstrate that is to show maybe a graphic, and hopefully, Shailen, you can see this, that the complexity of a smart infrastructure blueprint sets the stage on how we need to move forward. It is not just about smart mobility, which you can see on this area right here, but everything that we are talking about starts either at the very bottom, which is the sensor layer, or a decision by leaders and futurists, as well as policymakers, that we need to really embrace technology. So when we are talking about the complexity of a smart future, there are so many elements that really come together. And most of the times people get afraid, where do I start? How do I start? When do I start? And the easiest way to understand this chart is to understand that it's a layered cake. You can start at the bottom and move up, or you can start at the top and move down. But you cannot jump from one layer to the other without actually going through the other layers. That is a complex environment. And as we start understanding how we are going to make up for our deficit and how we invest and how we move forward, this particular approach allows you to understand the complexity that you need to address.
So, Rahul, a couple of things here. One, I love the cake analogy because I love cake. And I'm thinking back to my time, looking at any agency that I've run. And generally, when we think about a blueprint, we think about the different parts of a DOT that we have, right? So we have maintenance over here. We have, our bridge section. We have an HR section. And what I feel like this graphic shows is that is so one-dimensional for many of us to be thinking about. And really, it's a much more comprehensive roadmap that we need to be thinking about.
Exactly. If we think about the outcomes that we want to deliver for our citizens, if we think about how we need to manage with lower cost and higher results, we really need to think about orchestration of an ecosystem. And it's really getting to generating those insights and managing the technology in a way that it is truly delivering a benefit that is getting us to resilience, getting us to sustainability, getting us to less congestion, more option, more inclusion. It is generating solutions that most of us are actually used to when we use our devices. We push a few buttons and magic happens. Well, that magic is what this slide basically describes. This is everything that needs to happen behind the scenes for someone to say, I want to go from point A to point B, and how do I construct the best route with the least congestion? And maybe I want to do some sightseeing and prepay for a parking spot and understand how much carbon monoxide or how much sulfur or how much nitrous I'm going to be generating. All of that information is available, but only if we actually connect that ecosystem. And that complexity can be taken care of it today. However, how we get moving and how we get started, it's still a difficult conversation because it touches on people, it touches on funding and financing, and all of these can be addressed. The best of all is maybe we have a platform that addresses some of those complex issues.
Yeah, so I look at this blueprint, and as I'm thinking about this, I used to sit on the Northeast Corridor Commission, which is the rail line that runs from Boston down to Washington D.C. and even down into Virginia. And one of the things that we often talk about in infrastructure is how America has fallen behind the rest of the world in high-speed rail, as an example, right? So we had the Acela, and Amtrak does a great job, but it doesn't compare to the Shinkansen and some of the solutions that are over in Spain. And this is part of our challenge. And maybe Josephine, you've traveled a lot, seen a lot around the world. You lived and worked in Australia for a while. How do we take some of this 19th century infrastructure and balance this idea that we need to maintain and invest in that infrastructure, and then also sort of optimize what we have and then build for the future so that we are actually building a 21st century infrastructure?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's a great question, and one that we're all sort of grappling with, because similarly to what this slide shows, there's many layers to the problem. One, we have dilapidated infrastructure across many different asset classes, and in some pockets of the country, it's really, really good and it's been very well maintained, and in other places, it's really struggling. And so you have this kind of disparity of quality, and you have capacity issues that are not, the same across the country. And so when you think about investing in bringing everyone up to an equal standard and how we're going to move towards this future state that Rahul was talking about, that is, hyper connected and allows for, high broadband capacities and edge computing and, all of the solutions that we want on our, at our fingertips. It's not going to be a silver bullet that just fixes everything. I think what we're seeing a lot of is actually more and more innovative business solutions and private sector participation. So there's a higher degree of collaboration required between government and private sector, because frankly, the commercial actors are just not waiting for us to make decisions. They're sort of seeing business opportunities and jumping in. But where we, I think, have a role to play is making sure that as those innovative business models are developing, the government's also playing its role in actively protecting citizens and managing that risk and data in such a way that, we can all sort of benefit from those changes. So
you touched on an important word for public sector, leaders and the public sector in general, which is risk, right? So, a lot of public sector agencies, a lot of engineers, generally want to be risk averse. I've worked for 3 governors and nobody ever told me to go out and fail quickly, which is something I hear maybe a little overdone on the Silicon Valley side. So give an example of sort of mitigating some of this risk and sharing risk and how you can do that.
I think that you're absolutely right. The public sector is not incentivized to take risk. We have this kind of joke in the P3 space where everyone always says, you won't get fired for a project, a traditional delivery project that goes, badly or takes a long time. But if you do something a little bit different, if you take an innovative approach, you will be raked over the coals for it. And those are the things that make the headlines. So it is scary. And I think that, we all have a job to do in order to, I think, give our leaders the political courage and the confidence that they need to kind of step out on a limb, because that's what innovation requires. In a practical sense, where I'm actually seeing this happening is in local pockets around the country. So really at the city, municipal, regional level, there's a lot of great examples of, accelerators and project partnerships taking place. One in San Diego that immediately comes to mind, the municipal planning agency there created a vision advisory board. So Sandag basically said, come Ford Smart Mobility, come Verizon, come Cubic, tell us, what we should do with these projects and where the risks are that, we maybe need to start thinking about, and how we can work together to fund, finance, deliver these things, because they're solutions that we all want, but we don't all have the money, the capacity, the capability to deliver in one organization. So it's going to have to be a case of shared value.
Yeah. Polly Trottenberg, who's the New York City DOT commissioner, was just saying at our board meeting yesterday how she would love to be able to come to a space to be able to talk about, here are my challenges and here are, some of the solutions that we have found. And I think it's great that you're able to surface some of those. So let's dive in on an issue that is, I think, both vexing and troubling to a lot of us in transportation right now. And it's this idea around transit. So, I used to run transit when I was the secretary in Delaware. It's challenging at the best of times, and everybody wants to talk about fare box recovery and how is this, making money, and how are you not, why do you lose money on transit? And that was all pre-COVID-19. And now we're sort of trying to figure out this future of, we've got this population that is desperately reliant on transit because most decision makers in transit don't necessarily rely on the service to get around, to get to their job, to get to see a loved one. And then we've got this other reality out there where there's a lot of fear and concern about, and rightly so, about, am I going to get sick if I get on transit? Or, I think it's just better for me to stay in my car. And so Anant, I know you talk a lot about integrated mobility solutions. What, from a Deloitte perspective, what are you seeing on the transit side that can either give us hope or give us a chance to, make changes now?
That's a packed question there, Shailen.
What I do. By the way, I really appreciate you growing that beard on a couple of days' notice, just so that people didn't get us mixed up on this webinar.
Yeah,
Appreciate that.
You're welcome. So from our perspective, right, we've kind of really picked this up. As you can imagine, we're a consulting firm, and the topic of mobility, impacts several sectors and industries that we serve. And if you think about automotive, telecom, to public sector, energy and utilities, all these. So we formulated a practice to kind of study the implications of this about 5 years ago, right? And about a year into our research of that practice, we realized that the world's going to be heading towards what we call seamless intermodal mobility. At that point, we partnered with World Economic Forum, and over the last 3 years, we've advanced this idea of seamless intermodal mobility, and we have picked this up from kind of really at the heart of this, which was, how do you create models that really transcend, a specific app or a specific TNC service or a specific transit service, but gives, people or residents of the region the power to kind of transition to multimodality, and kind of gives them the choices, right? At the heart of this, I think we all come from various socioeconomic backgrounds, and it's very important that those choices need to be presented and empowering people to make a choice that's right for them. So that was kind of our vision, and we started studying it. It was very valid. Like, we've kind of gone around the globe validating this as part of our work. And, there's really no one public service entity has ever said that vision doesn't make sense. They all agree that that's the vision needed to kind of make this safer, cleaner, and cheaper for everybody. Now, but at the heart of that was, how do you really make that happen, right? We've, over the last 2 years, started thinking about the models that have to come into place to enable it, right? And we live in a world today where, there are multiple entities, and they all have their roles and responsibilities clearly defined, in a planning organization, to a municipality, to a transit, to a tech company, to a TNC. The roles are clearly defined. And what happens is, as you get into this multimodal world, the roles get challenged, right? And we're seeing this, right? With COVID, what's happened is TNCs are challenged, so they're trying to reinvent themselves. Transit authorities are challenged, they're trying to reinvent themselves. Planning organizations are starting to think about investments for the next 20 years, and they're reinventing themselves. So the point of this is there's reinvention starting to happen, which was always our premise, that the roles have to evolve in order for that multimodality and solutions to come through. That said, we also think that there's very interesting ways for public agencies specifically to interoperate. We've done the study in a region where, you think about the traditional role of a transit, the traditional role of an MPO, and the traditional role of a municipality. All three of them have to come together to make policies work that influence the behavior, right? So, for example, subsidizing just transit is one thing, but creating parking, so it creates first mile, last mile connectivity, is actually an MPO kind of planning decision. Surge pricing and congestion pricing, which plays a role in the way people consume, has a role the municipalities play. So the point of this is, to enable such solutions, you have to fundamentally rethink the current operating model that exists within the public sector. At the regional level, we've also thought about it. Is it a state problem or is it a city problem? We think it's a region. It's got a couple of different cities and regions to come together to work this. So that's part one. And on the other hand, I think the private sector has an interesting role here, which, they, in some ways or form, are defining the North Star for the experience of consumption, the app-based consumption that, we're all kind of used to get get the mode of transportation we want is resonating, because of which, private sector is starting to realize the value of it. However, they have to do things differently in this model as well. They have to be more transparent. They have to be more data has been a huge challenge, as we all can see. There are ways to make those work from a regional data broker models that we've been studying. So private sector has to lean in ways to support that. So Shailen, I know this was kind of a long-winded answer to your question, but the point is, we can't look at this as a pointed transit problem. I think we have to recognize that the world needs to move towards seamless intermodal mobility. And there are several players that have to come together at a regional level to make it happen. We've been kind of studying that and starting to define the transformation that takes place. As a consulting firm, we've known to drive a lot of transformation in sectors, but this feels like it's a problem that was right up our alley to solve for. So we feel like we're at the forefront. We haven't really realized the vision fully yet, but we sure feel like there are starting points to it that we can apply and get different regions to interoperate and therefore challenge their current works to what it needs to be in the future.
Yeah, I think that part of the challenge, and I've been at the federal level, I've been at the state level, I've been at the local level, is a lot of our transportation entities and programs. The US DOT came out of the 1956 interstate program and was set up for basically for the interstate, and new modes have been added to it, but that's sort of its inception. A lot of our planning comes out of that ICE-T, late 80s, early 90s phase. And, we're so focused on public engagement, but a lot of that, it's changing now, but a lot of that was like, can we have a public meeting in the community? Like that was viewed as good public engagement. And now with technology and data, it's totally reformed. And then even just these entities of trying to get interagency cooperation, there are regions that have done it really well. And there are regions who struggle with fiefdom and other challenges. So, I mean, I hear you looking at Rahul's, smart infrastructure blueprint and looking at data. You mentioned data. I think about the Central Ohio Transit Authority and what they're doing. They've been looking at things like outcomes for premature babies at the hospital, and tracing that back in terms of access to prenatal care, before birth, and showing that there is correlation around access to the hospital. And so I think that, we talked about all of this data. I think that, and maybe anybody can jump in here on, if you're running a DOT and looking at this blueprint, or any public sector agency right now, transit, MPO, what are some of the low-hanging fruit where you can say, the first thing you should do is get off this webinar and run out and do, and link, go talk to your public health people, or, some of these other pieces. Like what are some of the sort of easy wins that people can grab?
Yeah, I can start and I can have the team chime in. I know we're all kind of facing this from a couple of different angles. One thing when it comes to data is, I think the emphasis on, very specifically, right? All agencies have traditional ways for how they gather data. And they're all starting to realize that there are better and there's improved data out there. Nobody questions the fact that, there's better data out there. The question is, how do you get access to it? One of the easy things that comes to mind is there are a lot of, obviously, ways to procure and source data at this point, right? So if you're really in the business of gleaning insights, you could get the insights you want, right? I mean, sometimes it does end up meaning that you have to fund, paying for that data, but it also means that if it depends on what kind of insights you want, and is that publicly available information that you can get through open source data, or do you have to pay for that data? But at the heart of this is, you have to start with focusing on the insights you want. We see a lot of agencies kind of jump in with data as access problem, and that brings a lot of privacy concerns, which might be real, where you're asking private sector to share kind of fairly sensitive information about people. It kind of paints you into a corner at times. So my advice is always that focus on insights, and shape what insights you need with players in the region right, that have access to the data that can help with those insights. And if you can come up with a collaborative way to work there, and we are seeing some agencies do it and see success, is you have to build a collaborative model, a collaborative spirit, recognize the business that the private sector is in, recognize the outcomes and kind of the mission of the public sector. And if you spread that at a regional level and you drive that, I mean, more often than not, you start seeing the results.
Yeah, very quickly, Shailen, I think because of the issue of data, and I've stopped sharing the blueprint, but if you recall at the bottom, it talks about data sources. Communities that have thought through data management, data governance, data ownership, and data integration have moved closer to generating the value that people need. And the reason is because we are talking about a context for understanding where we are, everything around us, as it applies to not just transportation and mobility, but also as it applies to what do we do with our time and how do we actually leverage the technology for safety and security. So one of the things that everybody could hang up and run to, or after the webinar is finished, is think about, what is the data strategy for my community? Do I have one? How do I engage? Everything from understanding the sources of data, but data rights and data ownership and data revocation. Those are complex issues that everyone from the large data analytics company to the small companies are dealing with. And that is an issue at the federal level, at the state level. And so not every piece of data is generated from a public sector perspective, but every piece of data generated, regardless of who generates it, needs to be integrated to generate that insight. And sometimes it becomes a human capacity issue, and sometimes it just becomes understanding legislation, understanding rules and regulation. But at the end of the day, we all need to feel that the data that we are either sharing or not sharing is going to be secure. And data security, I think, is at the heart of making sure that we're not creating bigger problems ourselves. And I believe that is a significant struggle today, at least in the United States, because we do not have GDPR like the EU does or what California has created. And maybe those are complex conversations that need to be accelerated.
Yeah, and Shailen, sorry.
Go ahead, Bryan.
I just want to add one other component from what can you do if you run out of the webinar. Don't run just yet, but as soon as it's over, run out into your community and start looking at the partnerships that you have. Start understanding who has what data and how you can bring those aggregate sources together, and look at look at it in the context of a new partnership. We talked earlier, and we've heard many of our speakers and my great colleagues here talk about silos and being in one particular agency and not looking beyond that. You've had those experiences yourself. So I think one thing we can all do is look at partnerships in a new way, both public and private together, and public to public, where regions and states, and I think a lot of that's happening, but I don't think enough of it is happening because everybody gets in their own silo and they kind of stay there and they're dealing with the daily problems. But the ability to partner can change literally how agencies can advance collectively in a particular area, or in fact across the country.
Well, we're gonna get into the data privacy, cybersecurity, because I think this is what is critical. But before we get to that, I hear a lot of criticism sometimes that there's a lot of hype around technology, right? So we've been hearing about autonomous vehicles, coming next year for the last 5 years, and we're still on a path to get there. But I think the public is sometimes rightly skeptical around some of these things. A lot of discussion around 5G, and a lot of, I think, confusion as to what 5G is. And when I talk about this, I reference people and I say, look, if you get sick at home and an ambulance has to come to get you, the ambulance can use 5G technology to talk to other vehicles, can use it to talk to the infrastructure to get green lights all the way. But now we're entering into this space where all your medical records are available now potentially through 5G to the responding EMS folks. And as you're being transported to the hospital, the doctor, instead of seeing you for the first time when you get wheeled in with a general description, has potentially seen your medical records and has video and access. And these are all the positive things. But to get there, it's a significant level of investment. And so I think that all of us are acutely aware, particularly those of us who've been in the public sector or work with public sector, there's going to be a real budgetary challenge over the next couple of years. And almost this guns versus butter argument of, do we invest and maintain what we have, or do we take this, shot at technology? And so from a Deloitte perspective, how do you balance that, that need to invest now with the benefits of the future, with that need to take care of what is already out there?
Yeah. I can take a stab at it, right? Just starting. So 5G, autonomous, advancements in technology. The way I would simplify it for the purpose of the discussion these are all technologies that help you automate, right? So if you look at it from the lens of automation, right, where cars drive themselves, 5G also helps with automation because you have access to more information and connects things more, so you can automate things more. In some ways, I don't think the race here is a technology problem. I do think it's the hype. The technology hype is relevant because obviously it's cool, it's sexy, that's what people care for. But technology, in some ways, is already ahead of us being able to deal with it. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. Let's say you have a planner in an organization, right? When that plan, and let's say the planner is in charge of kind of making certain decisions, right? And let's say you basically change that planning tool and you bring in the best of breed simulation technology, right? That gives you insights on every 5 minutes for why congestion is taking place. And you can do that today. But the question is, if you do that, now the question really at the heart of this is, it's no longer a technology problem. The question is, what is the planner going to do differently by having that information every 5 minutes as opposed to having it once a year? And how often is he going to be able to act on that insight? And who does he have to work with to enable that insight? Who does he have to work with to define a concept? This is all a people problem. It's a policy problem. It's a process problem. And our perspective is going technology first, because that's what appears to be easy, is the route we see a lot of agencies and private sector take. But what is happening behind in the back end of it is you have left a massive vacuum on how people's job changes, how fundamental business process changes, how fundamentally operating model change. And I think that is the reason why we keep saying that AD is going to hit, and it's not been hitting us, because we are not prepared to evolve our processes around the technology that's starting to shape us. And I use this example, but even in our own personal lives, technology is so far ahead that we all don't know how to use it responsibly. So this is kind of a similar kind of opinion around technology is going to advance at a very rapid pace. Can government agencies rally around that technology in a way that they can manage and regulate? It's the jobs that they've always done, but can they use technology in ways to manage and regulate this at a faster?
Yeah, if I could just add a couple of things to it. So the use cases and the business cases to understand the value of technology is a critical element. If we want to understand the Vmax on a physical street, both in terms of speed and volume, technology can give you an answer today. But are you going to leverage it in terms of transit-oriented development, curbside management, because your planning, your zoning, and permitting may not be in sync with it? Do you have the rules and the regulations to take advantage of everything technology is telling you on how the covered pavement can be managed in such a way that you are allowing for certain speeds to operate safely and securely? So I think the business case and the use case in terms of data is where a significant lag is. So you can jump in technology, but as you go from data to information, information intelligence, intelligence to knowledge, getting to that knowledge curve and marrying that with all of the elements for success from a business and use case, I think sometimes we leave that to chance, and we cannot do that anymore.
I'm almost with Anant though on this one, because I kind of feel like it's almost like this self-fulfilling prophecy where we say if the business case is there, then it would work out. But the business case can't be there because the incentives aren't in place, and the incentives can't be in place because we have to play policy and legislative catch up. And that can't be in place because there isn't really the functioning ecosystem to give decision makers the confidence that they should make those changes. So it's like, what do we start with?
Disruption. We start with disruption, and that's what scooters and two-wheelers, and that's how it works. Disruptive technologies fill a gap where no one has really been able to match all of the different ecosystems, and that's why disruption is absolutely essential.
Yeah, I sort of interpreted Anant as saying that there's a chicken or an egg, and in this case we've got an autonomous chicken, and we don't even know what we're going to be able to do and whether it will lay an egg or not. But I agree on the disruption piece, although I would also say that there's sort of like the processes and the technology-enabled person who's able to, make better decisions. And instead of doing a traffic count, with somebody checking or a counter sitting across a road, you can create a digital twin and model out, all of these things. But there is the other side of it, which is this infrastructure investment, whether it's fiber, whether it's roadside units, whether it's small cell towers in cities, because you need a lot more density for that actual 5G network. And I think that there's going to be a competition amongst cities and regions to be sort of, you already see it. We're 5G enabled. Not that anybody knows what that means. So, and this does tie in a little bit to a question that we've got from Craig Milligan. For high bandwidth data sources, i.e. traffic video, where the analytics engines require high compute power, cities have two strategies. Edge analytics strategies are constrained by available edge computer power, and cloud analytics strategies are constrained by available bandwidth. Which strategy are you most excited about? Based on which constraint do you think we'll make progress on first? Anyone want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I can.
Go ahead, Rahul.
Yeah, I think leveraging high data compute, I think if you're just looking at phase change, there is an opportunity to do real connectivity, almost near real time to real time connectivity with phase change data. I think that allows you to understand the baseline and to only focus on the actual change that means anything. You can always remote massive amounts of data, but the real benefit of technology in 5G is, what is it that we want to do differently? Do we want to move more cars at higher speeds, given the physical limitation of the space we have paved? Or do we want to not have people in these cars, and we want to move large appliances from a transit perspective at higher speeds on dedicated lanes? So I think there's an opportunity to do both. Because you can have a fiber backbone, you can have the 5G low latency, high bandwidth capacities. But the more interesting thing is, can we move the phase change data in real time to fundamentally change the way we reimagine our appliances and where they're moving and how they're moving?
Yeah, I think there's often pre-technology, there was an argument as to, are these highways that move a large amount of trucks and vehicles, or are they, city streets, and they're there for people and bicyclists? And now we have new mobility options, and we have these technology solutions. At ITS America, we talk a lot about moving people, data, and freight, and what is the most efficient way to move them. And I think in the 1990s, it was about your Ford Expedition and the largest SUV you could get. And now we're thinking a lot differently about that. We've talked a lot about data, and to the extent that data is granular and personal and can be attributed to somebody, So, my general commute, where I like to go every day, that creates really big privacy issues for a lot of people. We've seen, phone data being used through some of these protests of late to show where people are, and, all sorts of advice going on out on the internet about how to turn off location services and things. I remember when we put locators on our snowplows, I won't say which state, but we had a spouse of a snowplow driver file for divorce because she tracked the snowplow and figured out that he was not where he said he was going to be. And so I think from a privacy perspective, how do we balance, this need, and we can talk about anonymization and things, but obviously there's a balance between privacy and the really important information that we need, and how do we balance that? Piyush, I don't know if you have an idea.
Yeah, sure. And I just want to kind of lay out the frame here, because it is a very complex structure. And if you recall the holistic blueprint that Rahul was projecting, the interdependencies of this digitally connected ecosystem where everything is connected to everything. And if you visualize the transportation ecosystem, where you got the complex set of technologies, the vehicles, the roadway systems, devices, toll collections, you name it, the list is keep growing on. And these things are sharing and communicating information with each other and their surroundings in a real time. And this is not a static environment, because as we are talking about the transit entities, thinking of expanding into maybe contactless technologies where in order to contain the disease, but create a more paymentless and contactless solution. So all that will require a lot of data and exchange of information. And the balance lies in the fact that the two principles that we always talk about, the transparency and the consensus of the data that you're collecting, and the purpose of the data that it is being collected for. So as long as we create that structure which allows citizens to manage the information that they are sharing, and create that structure of how the data is being traveled from one systems to another system in this complex ecosystem, and control around that, that will start to bring a little bit of a structure in the data management, data life cycle.
Yeah. So I think that, finding that balance on data is important. Another challenge that I see more and more of, we're creating systems of systems. And while we do that, and, we've talked about all these different agencies. So is it an MPO? Is it transit? We have all these cameras, data sources, data moving between vehicles, infrastructure. We had a cybersecurity incident in Colorado, which wasn't even a cybersecurity hack, as it was termed in the media. It was actually just somebody leaving a lockbox open on a variable message sign, all the way to a ransomware attack that shut down the agency. I feel like up to this point, and it's changing a little bit now, cybersecurity has been something that has been a bit of an afterthought, or sort of like, hey, let's build this thing, and we need to think about cybersecurity. Is that the right way, or should it be more of a foundational approach?
Yeah, and that's a classic, because the cyber, as we call it nowadays, cyber is everywhere, and that's just not a lip service, and I'll tell you why. When we talk about cyber in this complex interconnected system, it is very different from the cyber that we used to see actually in the traditional sense, where IT and data centers, because here cyber has expanded from the ITs and data centers and users to the devices and things that we see on our general life, right? So autonomous vehicles and cars and systems, the unlikely place where we see the cyber. So it is just not a lip service to say that the cyber is everywhere. But how do we manage risk in this environment? Because everything is just continuously expanding. So the key here is, and this is what is needed, a fundamental shift of how we look at these vectors, these things that are coming into the system. And instead of treating them as the individual systems or devices or components, we need to take a broader, a systemic view of how these vectors are going to interact with each other. What are the new connections that they will open? What kind of data that they will be sharing? How the interdependencies will be established, and how that will impact the overall functioning of the ecosystem. And that is what we call a programmatic approach to secure the integration of, or the just general broader ecosystem. And it starts right up in the value chain. As the products or these devices or things are being developed, integrating security by design, managing that third-party risk, and making the cyber control as part of the procurement of those assets, along with the cost and performance. Those are the traditional parameters that we use. And then as we are ready to bring those things into the system and integrate them, consider creating a threat profile, understand the risk that vector is going to introduce in the system, and then look at that asset from the holistic perspective, and then validation and testing, because what was true yesterday is not going to be correct tomorrow. So there has to be this continuous evaluation and monitoring of the risk ongoing basis. As the threats changes, the attack probability will change, things will continue to evolve. So I know it's a bit of a long-winded answer, but unfortunately there is not a single action that can address this evolving threat landscape, but it's a series of action in a programmatic fashion to address this mounting challenge, which is what we call a cyber by design. And I know it's a bit of a technical response as well there, but in Deloitte, we are establishing this cyber by design framework, which kind of talks about integration of activities into various different phases of this ecosystem, right from the conceptual stage all the way to the operation stage. And after the call, feel free to reach out to me to get more deep dive discussion on this.
Yeah, no, I think that the main takeaway there is, we sort of still have that early 2000s cybersecurity piece, which is, change my password from like my name and birthday to, let me reverse my birthday and nobody will hack that. And really it's all across the board. And again, this is the challenge, I think, for public sector agencies. You've got this, whether it's a payment structure, because you're working with a credit card company to process these payments, or you've got cameras, like there are just so many vectors into our system. And I almost feel like you can't rebuild the system, obviously, but this is one from a cybersecurity standpoint where I really feel like it is a pretty worthwhile investment for agencies to be like, if we had to redesign this, how would we start and where would we do it? Another question has come in from a anonymous attendee. What are examples of demonstration sites in the US that are leading the testing of ITS technologies, both public and private? And not sure if anybody wants to take a shot at that. Josephine, you were mentioning San Diego earlier. Do you want to just highlight that real quick?
Yeah, I mean, San Diego is a good example of where they are probably testing the innovative business models and public-private sector collaboration that I was mentioning. But if the question is more on technology test sites, I think that there's a handful of, AV and B2X different sites around the country immediately coming to mind. I know we're doing some work right now, actually, in Texas with Hillwood. Maybe, Anant, that's something that you want to touch on, is the work we're doing there.
Yeah, I mean, the regions wise, I'd say like, San Diego, Dallas, Florida, Broward County, and others. I think there are regions that are waking up. And I think what characterizes progress in these regions is, one, there's leadership from the public sector standpoint. Secondly, there are kind of private sector entities that are trying to rally up an ecosystem approach. So for one example, as Josephine was alluding to, is, with Hillwood, which is a real estate entity in Dallas, right? They are heavily invested in the region to the point where they're attracting businesses, but as part of that, we've helped stand up a mobility innovation zone with them. And the idea of that is to advance these technologies in collaboration with several private sector entities and public sector entities. An example of that might be autonomous trucking and freight technologies, and how are they going to get commercialized, and the role that public sector is going to have to play, the role private sector is going to have to play, integrated data solutions that have to come together to do that. So I think at the heart of kind of what advancement means is collaboration models where there's leadership from the public sector and interest and collaboration from the private sector.
Yeah. Go ahead, Bryan.
I might add, Shailen, there's in-city, there's VDOT's working with a private company who's running the hot lanes transurban on autonomous and connected vehicles. There's the work you did in Colorado that involved, a whole host of different ITS technologies. If you look at Ohio and Drive Ohio, I think a lot of the DOTs and the major transit and transportation agencies and authorities are taking the lead, but the private sector is involved, and sometimes in the testing, sometimes in the collaboration. I think the great thing is we've got this in America, the melting pot is, we sort of have this melting pot of ITS experimentation that's happening all across the country in different pockets and in different ways.
I'll just complete the conversation here. Every automotive company has a test bed. Florida with FIA and SunTrax. You've got the MCD that was mentioned. The Pentagon is testing autonomous logistics vehicles. And in addition to that, you've got 7 states that have done truck platooning. And then the manufacturers, the OEM, everything from Siemens to Continental, Tevez to Bosch, they all have test sites in about 20 states in the US. So it's a fairly healthy ecosystem.
Yeah, I think about Las Vegas and what they're doing around, sort of like, V2X technology, autonomous shuttles and autonomous vehicles that are out there. And I actually think that the actual answer to that question, which probably is very different than it was 5 or even 10 years ago, instead of just saying Ann Arbor or, Denver or of course, San Francisco, it's everywhere. I remember being in Lincoln, Nebraska, and them doing a autonomous transit vehicle, deployment. And so I would say that there are deployments all around the US. And actually now you can almost decide, am I looking at V2X? Maybe it's Tampa, right? Or am I looking at autonomous vehicles? Oh, let's look at what is going on with CMU and Uber in Pittsburgh. Oh, am I, you could just look at all of the different technologies. Port Authority of New York, really out there in terms of connecting airport, seaport, and transit and highways. So it's integrative. And there was a question or a comment that came in about China versus the US and how the prospects look bleak for the US. Look, I was in a TMC in Shanghai a couple of years ago, and I was both impressed and somewhat concerned that within 3 minutes of a crash occurring, they had a camera on the vehicles and they were able to communicate with the drivers and tell them to pull over. That is max efficiency that I don't think we'll be at in the US anytime soon, because privacy concerns, I don't think will allow for Americans to say, yeah, watch me and then tell me to pull over because you're able to see where I am at any moment. But I think that there is strength in all models, but I'm pretty confident for the American market that the ingenuity is going to continue. So Bryan, when we led, a DOT, a big part of the challenge was how do you repair roads and bridges, because that's what DOTs have been doing for 100 years. And, I tried to hire a chief data officer when I was in Colorado and had 2 big problems. One, they wanted the salary 3 times mine as the executive director, and can't have that. You can't make more than the governor, 3 times more than the governor. And also they were like, how many data scientists do you have? How many data analysts do you have? And I was like, 0, you're a team of 1. So that didn't go very far. And what we ended up doing is we procured it, right? Because I can't hire that person, but I can procure it as long as I'm not growing government. So from a workforce perspective, what is Deloitte suggesting that a lot of our public agencies do at this time?
Well, it's a critical issue for all agencies. In fact, it's one that we're ourselves at Deloitte are undertaking. What is the future of work, and how does that play out in terms of the work that needs to be done the workforce that will do it, and then the workplace. And we've now seen, as evidence of this webinar, our workplace has taken a radical change just in the last 3 months. In fact, the future of work, in many respects, is upon us right now. But specifically to transportation, we've been doing work with a couple of agencies talking about the future of work in the context of the macro trends that we've discussed here, from technology to smart infrastructure to data to cyber to the partnerships and finance and funding issues. And then we've looked at it also in the context of what are those disruptors that are happening that we've mentioned, and then how do you manage your agency? One of the things that's going to be critical is that agencies be a lot more flexible and nimble. Look at the gig economy and gig workers. Look at those that are retiring, which is an enormous strain on our STEM system, and we don't have enough STEM graduates coming in to the DOTs and the major transportation agencies. What is happening in terms of those that are leaving, and how can they leave a legacy? Maybe they'll devote 10 or 15 hours a week as a part of training that new incoming workforce, but also, and then to learn sort of the system, but that new and incoming workforce can then train those that are actually in the agency that have been there for 25 years on the latest and greatest in terms of technology or data analytics or cyber. And so I think there's I'm reminded of the old saying that the only thing that is constant is change. This is a massive system of change, some of which has happened literally in the last 3 months, that will impact the workforce, and the workplace of agencies. And so now agencies must look at this combination. Do I go out and buy that particular skill set? Do I use it for a period of time? Do I actually upskill traffic engineers who are really intently interested in autonomous and connected vehicles? Does that upskilling then take a little bit less money than trying to go find an autonomy engineer? And I can create an autonomy engineer in my own department. I think these are big challenges that all agencies are grappling with right now. A lot of agencies are frozen. They don't know what to do. But it is changing on a daily basis. And the key is to get ahead of it, be proactive, look at those areas that are critical, find those public areas in the public sector where you can make changes within your organization from an upskilling, partner with universities, and then on the other hand, use the private sector where it's necessary in a different kind of partnership to bring those skill sets into your organization.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. If nothing else, you never waste a good crisis, and I think this is an opportunity for agencies to rethink themselves, and many are, but you want to rethink and then be strategic in the way that we make this happen. Last question. I mean, I'll just go to Rahul on this one for a quick answer. We know that there's probably going to be $500 billion or $1 trillion spent on infrastructure in the next couple of years, because I think we all agree that there'll be some sort of stimulative type investment. If we do it well, and we balance this mixture of infrastructure and technology. How does the world look in 5, 10, or 15 years? And and why is the world a better place because we made that investment?
You're on mute.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a great question, and this is really a personal opinion. I'd love to know how much water I have used and how it relates to maybe another family somewhere else. And to do that, I actually have the tools. It's just not connected, as some of my colleagues have said, in order to generate that insight. I would like to know what are my options to actually go from one place to the other, and what is the best way to maximize whatever standards I have, whether it's time, whether it's the reduction to the emissions, or my personal well-being. For the very first time in our civilization, as explorers and as a group of people that like to see what's on the other side, for the very first time, we have the opportunity to take advantage of miniaturization, computation power, high bandwidth, and insights to understand what our impact on the ecosystem is and how we can improve that. So 5 years from now, 6 years from now, maybe I say I want to go visit something and I'm using a personal pod that's sterile, or I go and with a group of people that I like to meet on my journey. And on the way, I can do the things that I want. And I can also specify, I don't want to use dino juice. I want to use this and I want to use that. So 5, 6, 7 years from now, I think we as humans have the opportunity to recast how we have leveraged technology for not only our benefit, but the benefit of everyone else around us and of the planet. I think that is a unique situation to be in, where our inclusion perspective can definitely generate a very different approach to getting to the future.
Well, look, at ITS America, we talk about a better world transformed by intelligent mobility, one that is safer, greener, and smarter. And I feel like all of your answers today have really driven that. And so thank you very much, and look forward to working with our Deloitte partners in the future.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And to the participants. Cheers.